All right, I have my little stack of 4x4 inch fabric squares. Just have a stack of them handy because you'll want to practice this a lot, and it's just good to have a bunch of them handy. And definitely make sure that you've pressed them well. That's just a basic of sewing, and then of course you just don't want to stitch with something that's not pressed well. So let's turn our machines on, and I am going to be able to adjust my settings here because my my machine is computerized. I want to set it at a stitch length of 1. My stitch width does not matter. Let me bring you a little tighter. My stitch width doesn't matter because my machine's not going to move back and forth. So you can have your stitch width set at anything you want. It just basically, when you're doing a straight stitch, your stitch width is almost going to be more of a needle position. So if you want to stitch on the far left, like right now my needle is on the far left side of things, and so if you want to stitch in the center of your foot or in the far right side, that's what your stitch width is going to affect in a straight stitch. We'll move on to zigzag stitch in a little bit where it will matter, but stitch width doesn't matter for this one. Stitch length at 1. If you do not have a computerized machine and it's just dials, probably your stitch length is on the far right side of your machine, and so you'll be able to just adjust it that way to a 1 length. We're going to start with 1, and then we're going to move on to a couple other lengths, and I'm just going to kind of explain to you what each length means, how it would be used. So this is our first stitching opportunity. I want you to pay close attention to the little marks on your needle plate. Those are going to be your seam guide. You see I've got, you can see way back here, the 5/8 inch. That's the most common seam width, and that only applies if your needle is in the far left position. If you move your needle over, then obviously your stitch is not going to be 5/8 of an inch. So those seam guides, those measurements are assuming that you have your needle in the far left position. I'm going to go ahead and run this stitch length of 1 along the 5/8 inch seam. Can you see okay? When you're using such a short stitch, it's going to be super easy to sew a straight line because it takes longer, so it goes slower. I'll speed it up. Okay, finish up, snip your threads, and we've got this teeny tiny little stitch. You'll be able to look at yours better, but that is a very, very fine stitch, and that stitch is going to be used for things like turning tight corners. We're doing something that's going to be very detailed. This is not a common stitch length, but I wanted to show that to you first. All right, now I'm going to move my stitch length up to 2.5. 2.5 is the most common stitch length. It's used for construction stitches. A construction stitch is when anytime you're sewing 2 pieces of fabric together, so that when you open it up, it's got a very, very nice tight seam there. Anyway, that's going to be the most common stitch. After we practice just doing it on a single piece of fabric, I would recommend stitching 2 pieces of fabric together and pressing that seam open. You could even try that with all the different stitch lengths and understand that way why 2.5 inches or 2.5 stitch length is your best in terms of it not being too many stitches, but also not being such wide stitches that you've got puckers. So let's go on and stitch this one. And I'm going to use, this time, instead of using the guide numbers on my seam or my needle plate, I'm going to get my line straight a different way. I'm going to make sure that my first line is always in line with the outer edge of my presser foot. So I'm using that first stitch as a guide. And you can already see, well, can me see. You can already see, and you'll be able to look at yours better, that difference in width. This is going to be something, this probably looks like a more familiar stitch width to you. So that is 2.5. Now our third stitch width is going to be 3.5. And this stitch is used for top stitching, which we'll cover a little bit later in the week, but it's not for construction stitches. It's too far apart for it to be sturdy and reliable. So let's go ahead and get that stitch going. And just guide your fabric gently with your hand as you go. You can go nice and slow so you don't have to worry about it jumping out of control. Here's our third stitch. You have to look at yours too. This is going to be something for if you're top stitching or for other stitches that are not construction stitches, and we'll come across those as we go through the next couple of weeks. And then the final stitch I want to teach you is the basting stitch. Okay, so the final stitch that we're going to do is a basting stitch, and that's a stitch length of 5. Your machine should go up to about 5. I think that's a pretty standard stitch length maximum. This is called a basting stitch because it's used to stitch 2 pieces of fabric together that you don't want to be permanent, just to hold something in place, just kind of like a post-it note versus super glue. So let's do the stitch and then I'll show you what I mean. And this stitch goes a whole lot faster. Make sure your threads are facing the back of the machine. And this stitch does go pretty quickly because it's a longer stitch. Okay, so here's the cool thing about a basting stitch. Let me zoom out. It is not permanent, and so you can pull on the thread. If I can get the right thread. And just like that, your stitch is gone. And so that is to hold something in place. It can be somewhere where that part of your garment may ultimately show, but because you can pull that stitch out so easily, it doesn't matter. And so you'll come across that more in garment construction and that kind of a thing, but it is a common stitch. It's the longest stitch length, and it's called the basting stitch. So stitch that in there a couple of times and pull it out a couple of times just to kind of get the feel for what that 5 stitch length feels like. And now you can get out your handy dandy sewing book, go to that first page and paste your newly stitched fabric on there. I used just double-sided tape, and I just kind of marked stitch 1, stitch 2, stitch 3, stitch 4, and then at the bottom I just kind of gave that information. It's a short stitch, the length, and then kind of why you would use it. And so this is just my quick reference for what those stitch lengths will do. And then that'll be page 1, and page 2 is going to be zigzag stitches.